Good morning, everybody. This is Thomas van Howard from Cogen Europe speaking. Thank you all for joining us for the PACE webinar, Fuel Cells in Buildings, an easy plug-and-play solution to reduce energy costs and emissions. I'm very pleased to have with me today two distinguished speakers. The first one is Jan Willem Tolkamp from Solid Power, one of the main manufacturers of stationary fuel cells in Europe. And I also have with me today, virtually, George Carew Jones from Element Energy, an energy consultancy from London. Today we are going to talk about the potential of stationary fuel cells and more precisely fuel cell micro cogeneration. Before we kick off this webinar, I would like to announce three practical issues. So first of all, in order to avoid noise during the presentation, all participants have been muted upon entry. I also have a colleague here on the webinar who will serve as a muter, so in case you would by accident unmute yourself, my colleague will mute you. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded. So after this webinar, you can share the recorded version with your colleagues in case you and your colleagues would like to re-listen to this webinar. And finally, there is a possibility to ask your questions in the chat function. So we will give first the three presentations, and during the presentations you can already type your questions. We will collect the questions after the three presentations. I will then ask them to the presenters, and then you will get an answer to your questions. I will start by sharing my presentation. So today during this webinar, you're going to learn four things. So first of all, you're going to learn more about the potential of the technology fuel cell micro cogeneration. We are a firm believer that this technology has a great future. Everybody nowadays is talking about hydrogen and the hydrogen strategy. Mostly that is about hydrogen used in mobility and in industry. While we are also a firm believer of hydrogen in mobility and industry, we think that there is also great potential for the development of the use of hydrogen in buildings, and more precisely in stationary fuel cells to generate heat and electricity. Secondly, Jan Willem from Solid Power will shed some light on the more practical and technical aspects of the technology, and actually how easy it is already to install the technology today in your house or small business. And then thirdly, you will get a presentation of the technologies currently on the market. And then lastly, we will say a few words about the profile of people installing the technology already today. So my first slide is about the importance and why we think this technology matters. So first of all, the technology can either run on pure hydrogen or on natural gas. As you see in the infographic on the left side, the unit is connected to the gas grid, and then inside the unit, gas is transformed into hydrogen, and then inside the fuel cell, hydrogen is transformed into heat and electricity. This is a very efficient solution, so you can save a lot of primary energy, which also results in a reduction of CO2 emissions. Also, a very important aspect is that you can generate your heat and electricity on site, so you will become much less dependent on the electricity grid. Also, this brings a lot of system benefits because since the stationary fuel cell unit generates electricity on site, it also reduces the strain on the electricity grid, which then can bring relief to the grid, as we see that Europe is today electrifying with more and more electrical vehicles and heat pumps coming onto the grid. So in a nutshell, this is the PACE project. So we are 9 partners, 5 manufacturers, 2 universities, supervisioning the project, and then Element Energy, who is today also on the call, while Cogen Europe is coordinating the entire project. So the goal is to install 2,800 fuel cell micro cogeneration units in Europe, and more precisely in 10 countries. 4 countries are the front runner, which are the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, and Italy. We have a total budget of 90 million euros. The project started in 2016 and is supposed to end next year. Here you will find an overview of all the units which have been installed and produced so far. I will not go into the details. I will share with you my presentation after this call, so you can have a look at it, and also George from Element Energy will say a few more words about the units and the unit development under the project. So here is an overview where most of the units have been installed. And as you can see, a lot of units have been installed in Germany and Belgium, and more precisely in the northern part of Belgium. That is due to a very supportive scheme designed by the government. So far, the last numbers we have are from March 2020, when more than 1,000 units have already been installed under the PACE project. So to sum up again, all the benefits of the technology. So if you install this technology today in your house, you can already save 30 to 50% of CO2 emissions. This is a no-regret solution. It is future compatible, and it provides already a very fast CO2 reduction. The technology is fuel flexible. So nowadays it is connected to the gas grid, but the units are already 100% hydrogen ready. So if there would be a hydrogen network available, they could already have been connected to the hydrogen network. As I also mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, it is an enabler of the integrated energy system, because thanks to the electricity it generates on site, it relieves the strain on the electricity grid. So it will be much more easy for our electricity grid to make sure that the increasing number of electrical vehicles and heat pumps can receive their electricity. So now I have come to the end of my presentation. I would like to give the floor now to Jan Willem Tolkamp from Solid Power, who will tell you more how the technology actually functions and how easy it is already to install today the technology. So, Jan Willem, I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay, thank you, Thomas.
I think you're now presenter.
And I'll try to share my screen. Are you already seeing something?
Yes, now we can see your presentation, Jan Willem.
Okay, good. I'll go ahead. So I hope everybody can see my slides now. My name is Jan Tolkamp. I'm working for Solid Power in mostly market development and sales. I've got a technical background, and most of my presentation will also be technical. At least I will try to put things in a more technical perspective and say something about the technology and the installation. Some of it will be repeated from Thomas's presentation and slides, but I think that's just good to emphasize a little bit more on the specifics of the technology and the high efficiency, etc. So what is fuel cell micro CHP? It's a long word. I'd rather talk about energy systems for your home because they produce all the power that you need. And if you wish, also the heat. You can even combine it with a heat pump. So you would power your own heat pump with your own electricity. And you will do that on site, so that makes it very efficient, as Thomas already explained. Other than that, it's easy to install. So if you know how to install a boiler or another gas appliance, you can also install a fuel cell because it's not much more complicated. Because there's no combustion and no rotating parts, it's very silent. So it's basically only making the noise of a desktop computer. And the only noise you hear is the cooling fan of the electronics. It's very flexible. So if you need more power, you just put another unit in your home. And if you put a lot of them in a container, you have a very robust and system on which you exchange only one fuel cell if something goes wrong, and the other ones will take over. So you will always have power and backup power if you like. Because of its efficiency, of course, you have lower energy costs. So you will save on your electricity bill, and especially because electricity prices rise, and especially also the grid cost will rise big time in the next couple of years. You will have a lot of benefits from producing your own electricity on site. In many countries, there's support for this technology, mostly in Germany, where it all more or less started. In Germany, they've seen that with solar and wind, you can cover a big part of the year, but mostly only half of the year because sun is not always shining and the wind's not always blowing. And sometimes they do it at the same time. And then all the other times you need something else, and you can do that with stored energy from green power produced by sun and wind. And therefore you would need fuel cells to turn it back into power again if you want to have that power. Because it's so efficient, of course, you will save primary energy and carbon, as Thomas already explained. And because there's no combustion, so there's no flames, no heat produced by flames, there will also be no combustion products like NOx and SOx, so no sulfur and no nitrogen oxide. in the exhaust gases, or exhaust air, I actually must say. It's future-proof, like Thomas already said. We actually need hydrogen to run a fuel cell. But of course, at the moment, nobody has hydrogen at home or in their business available. So we currently use still natural gas or biogas, green gas, to produce hydrogen from what we get available from the grid. This is a typical installation. So you have your fuel cell in your home, you connect it to the gas grid, you connect it to the electricity grid and your home power electricity system or board. And then you will have your power for your appliances in the home, your lighting, etc. But maybe also for your heat pump if you've got electric heating. And there's some waste heat that you obviously also can use in your home, because you will always need domestic hot water and of course in winter times heating for your home. And again, if you don't have enough power with one unit, you can easily cascade them very closely together to gain more power. In this case, you see a cascaded system of 5 units, giving you around 7 to 8 kilowatts. So the principle of fuel cell, this goes both for PEM or any other type of fuel cell. At Solid Power, we make solid oxide fuel cells. So they're also called ceramic fuel cells, work with a high temperature. And the basic principle is that you add separately oxygen and hydrogen to the fuel cell. The fuel cell is more or less a membrane that only lets oxygen go through, and then it meets the hydrogen, and both hydrogen and oxygen react together into water again. In this case, in our fuel cell, it would be steam because of the high temperatures. And in that process, electricity is also produced and a bit of waste heat. And of course, the waste heat and the power are the products that we actually use these fuel cells for in a domestic system. So again, the efficiencies in a short sheet. So it's silent. It's a high efficiency unit. No emissions, wide range of fuels. So basically any fuel that you have available can be turned into hydrogen and then run through the fuel cell. And if you do it with renewable fuels, you actually have your CO2 captured in that closed cycle. This is a picture of a typical installation. So on the left-hand side here, you see one of the fuel cells. In that fuel cell, basically the waste heat from the fuel cell goes towards the exhaust, and before it leaves the unit, it goes through a heat exchanger that extracts the heat into usable heat. You just pump water through that, in this case, plate heat exchanger, and then you turn it into usable heat using a buffer tank mostly. And in our case, it's only very little heat, only 500 watts. That's continuously produced up to 850 watts. And if you connect that to a small pump, you can actually extract that water from the heat exchanger and store it in a buffer tank, and you'd add up to like 200 or 300 liters of domestic hot water each day using the heat of the fuel cell. It's a system that is connected to the internet. So both for maintenance, this is very important, but also for monitoring, to check whether your device is doing what it should do. So it's both for the customer and the company that maintains the unit. It's a great system, so you can always see what the current status of production and maintenance would be, if filters need exchanges, etc. And that's all conveniently added into an app where you can even modulate your unit. So if you are going on holiday and you only need base load to have your heating pump running, etc., you can put it down to 500 watts, or if you need more power, you can put it up to 1500 watts in our case. I also want to explain a little bit why you should use fuel cells. Currently, not many people know this, but we lose a lot of energy during the production and transportation through our homes or businesses. This is the typical average in Europe. So there's a lot of coal-fired plants still, old coal-fired plant, new ones, new gas ones that are the most efficient ones at the moment. And of course, we have renewables. But if we do it the old-fashioned way, like we still do in 80–85% of the cases, or even more in some countries, then you lose 45–70% waste already produced during production. And this waste heat is not captured, it's going into the cooling towers and then up into the air. Then we have transformation to high kilovolts going to the transportation grid, and then we transform it down to 230 volts again, or 380, and use it in our buildings. And only 25–40% actually remains of that energy we had in the first place for your power. And of course, the heat is not used in this equation anywhere. If you do that at home on site, where you actually need that power and heat, then of course it will be a lot more efficient. So only that in itself is more efficient than centralized power production. And if you do it at home together with solar systems and wind power, you have a great system that actually will be self-sufficient for local areas to actually fit the needs of that specific area. And then you will be 3 times more efficient doing a decentralized power production towards the centralized power production that we still currently mostly do. Why fuel cells again? Well, we have electricity grid, we have the gas grid, both great infrastructures that we are already paid. So we will use those infrastructures also in future. And the good thing is that they can actually cooperate very well together. You can turn power into molecules, so basically into hydrogen, but you can also turn hydrogen, stored hydrogen, back into power again with fuel cells at the moment that you want. The big disadvantage of renewable power systems like solar power and wind power is, of course, that it needs to be sunny or at least light. And we don't have that in wintertime, not much, at least in Western Europe. And the more north you go, the worse it gets. And of course, wind power is also not always there. So basically, the bigger half of the year you can cover with renewables, fluctuating renewables, and the other half you actually have to cover with stored energy, stored renewable energy in future. And at the moment, of course, we still have to use a lot of gas and coal to cover our needs. But to the future, this will change. So the purple arrows pointing downwards are actually pointing into the future. To the left, you see the electricity grid, and to the right, you see the power grid, the gas grid. And the storage potential of the gas grid is already enormous, whilst the storage capacity of the electricity grid is very limited. Actually, it only can store electricity if you add batteries or other storage devices to that grid. The grid in itself can't actually store energy. So once you have produced power at times that you can't use it in the grid, that it's sufficient and you have power left, then you can turn it into hydrogen with electrolyzers, store it in the gas grid, and take it from the gas grid again with fuel cells and turn it into power at the moment that you need it, like during nighttime or wintertime. Well, these slides are actually made for some questions. So these are some use cases. A lot of our units go to SME businesses to produce the power and of course the heat that we use in restaurants. This is an example of a restaurant, and they got a payback time of I think it's 7 years. It says here somewhere, but at least it's a very good investment in Belgium and also in Germany, and it has a payback times of 10 to 12 years in other countries where the subsidies are less or even none available. So this is where I want to leave my presentation. I think it's already about time also, so I'd like to carry over the floor to George.
Thank you, Jan Willem, for your interesting presentation. I've seen we already got many interesting questions. So I've all noted them down. They will be asked right after George's presentation. Jan Willem, can you make George the presenter so he can share his presentation with us?
I'm not sure if I can do that, but
on the right side in the list of participants. Oh, yes. He's sharing.
Yes, so you should be able to see that already.
Yeah. So you're the presenter only, right? Okay, then I'll say goodbye and get into the discussion again during the questions. Good luck.
Okay, thank you to Jan Willem and to Thomas then for that presentation. So in my section now, I'll be talking a little bit about essentially where the current stationary fuel cells in houses are in Europe. And then I'll try and describe a little bit why they're there and how we can get them into more places. And then I'll focus a little bit on the sort of customer perception data that we've collected from the PACE project so far to see what we can learn from that. And as we're going through this presentation, I kind of want to try and build a story or a narrative for you, which the PACE project is trying to convey, which is that these units are very much a mature technology now that are ready to move into the stage of mass market activity to allow decarbonization of domestic energy in Europe. But to get to the point of them being able to contribute that, they do need some support for that uptake. And I'll try and outline a little bit what policies and what support is required to get them to the point where they can express their potential. So to start with where the units are, there's two major geographies for fuel cell micro-cogeneration, which broadly aligns with the two largest funding schemes in the world for subsidy schemes for this technology. So starting with Europe, there's roughly 10,000 units across Europe installed to date, of which just over 1,000 are due to the PACE project, and then roughly 5,000 to do with other projects such as the German national funding scheme or the Ennefield projects, which preceded the PACE project. But one interesting lesson to learn comes from the other side of the globe, where in Japan there's roughly 400,000 stationary fuel cells installed in homes, which was part of the national Farm projects in Japan. So that's kind of a success story that we can always draw upon to say that this is a technology that works on that scale. And there are also some additional smaller markets in the US and Canada which aligns with some smaller field deployments in those countries. But they tend to be on the larger side rather than the domestic fuel cells. So to focus on Europe, try and explain a little bit why the units are where they are. And Thomas has already mentioned Germany and Belgium as the two biggest markets in Europe. And I noticed in the chat box, someone asked why Spain wasn't, doesn't feature in terms of fuel cell micro CHP deployment at the moment. And I think there are three major causes that we can look at. The first one is to do with funding schemes, essentially, which obviously incentivizes uptake. But then there's also a point to do with gas grids and where gas infrastructure currently exists. And also there's a price point in regards to electricity tariffs or electricity prices and gas prices. So Germany and Belgium in particular have relatively high electricity prices. So Belgium has the third highest. I think Germany has the second highest electricity price in Europe, but they both have relatively low gas prices at about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Conversely, with Spain, where the electricity price is quite low and the gas price is incredibly high, that's why fuel cell micro CHP is a slightly less attractive option there versus, for example, electrified low carbon heating options like heat pumps. But there are options in every geography for deploying this technology and embracing the potential that Jan Willem has outlined. And to explain where the PACE project fits into that picture, if you look at this thematic on the bottom left of this slide, we have a cost volume curve, which is essentially the rationale behind our project, which is to try and increase the production volume of fuel cell micro CHPs, which therefore drives down the cost of each product per user. As we get into a sort of point of early market uptake, moving towards mass market uptake. At that point, it's really about investment in this technology. And the message that we want to try and put forward is that this is a technology that's being heavily invested in Europe at the moment. So from 2016 until now, more than 350 million euros has been pledged in investment in stationary fuel cells, which, according to the Fuel Cells and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking, accounts for about a third of all investment in the production of and use of hydrogen over that period. So this really is a fledgling market which deserves focus. But the caveat that we would add to that is that this technology still requires further policy support in order to create a level playing field with incumbent, but also other low carbon heating technologies and energy production technologies. To drive this point home, I have this slightly text heavy slide, but hopefully indicative and useful for everyone, which presents three major business models or use cases for consumers to essentially have fuel cell micro CHPs in their home. And at each of these different business models, different policy support can apply to help incentivize individuals to buy fuel cell micro CHPs by reducing the payback time or essentially making the technology cheaper. So the first one is this traditional business model where the user, this is the most common one, is the first thing to say. But the user buys a unit directly from the unit manufacturer, such as Solid Power, and they install it in their home, and it offers them heat and electricity throughout the year, with other co-benefits, such as the ability to electrify their home, charge their electric vehicle, whatever the case may be. And as Jan Willem has shown, this can be a competitive business model because you save on your electricity tariffs each year. However, it is presented with quite a large upfront cost, as fuel cell micro CHPs are still a bit more expensive than buying a traditional boiler would be. The second business model is a service-based approach, which we're seeing across all industries, the kind of platform model or the Uber model, whereby instead of you buying the unit, you essentially loan the unit from an energy service company, which distributes the cost on a contracted basis across a number of years rather than paying upfront. It's not something we see much in the industry at the moment, but it is a potential use case, which removes that barrier of upfront cost. And across both of those business models, traditional subsidy schemes such as the scheme we see in Germany and in the Flanders region of Belgium, where there's dual installation subsidies, so the installer cost is paid for by the government or by the public bank, KfW in Germany. Or there's a feed-in tariff scheme where you get an extremely competitive rate for feeding in electricity to the grid, which then reduces the payback period for the product. And essentially our message would be that if those schemes are deployed across more countries in the same way that they have been for technologies like solar and increasingly for heat pumps, then this technology can reach the mass market. But there is also a third business model that kind of extracts the full potential out of fuel cell micro CHP, which is what Jan Willem mentioned in regards to demand side flexibility, or essentially offering grid services to a grid operator, whereby in periods of low renewable generation, you're able to feed electricity into the grid at highly competitive rates. Often this is achieved through aggregating these units into a virtual power plant or a VPP, which is not something we have time to go into the details of, but if you're interested, then contact us and we can give you some literature in regards to that. But this again decreases the payback time, makes the unit ownership relatively lucrative in some markets. And as this statistic at the bottom of the page shows, up to 3,500 euros per kilowatt of electricity could be avoided in power distribution costs through using fuel cell micro CHP in this way. And with some of that saving passed back to the consumer, this immediately becomes a very competitive way of producing heat and electricity for your home in a low carbon way. So if you're not already convinced by my analysis, then there are two more points I'd like to make before we move on to the customer perceptions data, which is that the newest generation of these units, or generation 2, we sometimes call it generation Y, have all entered the market in the last year, which shows that this is an industry that is getting the investment that it needs from the supply side. These units have extremely high efficiency, improved design, improved stack lifetime, etc. So this shows that this is a fully mature market. And the final point to make here is that there is already data to prove what I'm saying in terms of these units having been in operation for millions of hours during projects such as Ennerfield and the Calix project in Germany, having produced many gigawatt hours of power. So hopefully that concludes my narrative, that these stationary fuel cells are a ready technology to be uptaken if supported correctly. So with just a few minutes left, I'll go over some of the customer data, which is taken from 300 surveys completed by some of the PACE customers up until the end of last year. And this just provides a brief profile of what the market looks like at the moment for this technology. So we generally characterize typical customers as family homeowners who are slightly more towards the high income side, but who are looking to replace their existing heating technology with a more environmentally friendly alternative. So you can see that the vast majority of consumers at the moment own their building. Mostly they're residential. They tend to be in the sort of 60 to 90,000 euro household income bracket. But hopefully that income distribution shows that it's not just the uber wealthy who are investing in these units. It's also regular Europeans who believe they can get payback, especially with existing subsidy schemes. And if we look at the house type that these people live in, the first thing to say is that it's not all residential. And about 6% of consumers are small to medium-sized enterprises who are looking for a cheaper way of heating and powering their business. But the majority are still, detached home owners. And I think another interesting thing to note is that when we look at building age, it would be tempting to think that, as some of these photos show, that all of these houses would be sort of shiny new builds somewhere in rural Germany with extreme insulation. But the answer is actually that most of the houses for base consumers are sort of post-World War II, latter half of the 21st century houses, which just reflects the building stock of Europe, really. And a particularly interesting thing to note is that a number of these houses are actually older heritage buildings where insulating them is quite difficult, and therefore electrified heating solutions like heat pumps don't work very well. So that's really one use case for fuel cell micro CHPs that increasingly we're looking at. And then the final thing to say here is that whilst we have these statistics here showing the primary reason for why certain consumers acquired fuel cell micro CHPs, and there were two environmental considerations in there in regards to primary energy saving and CO2 emissions reduction. It was actually the cost saving that motivated the largest individual segment of consumers to invest in fuel cell micro CHPs. So whilst we would characterize our consumers generally as green and innovative early adopters of new technology, I do want to emphasize that they're still price-sensitive consumers that are not willing to pay a huge amount more for an eco-friendly option. As you can see here, the statistics are that about half would be willing to pay an additional 2,000 euros upfront, assuming operational savings of 30 euros a month, but about half wouldn't. So it is really about incentivizing the individual to have a strong use case. And as I've said, there is policy options to allow that to happen. So very quickly, I'll run through some project resources that we've developed, some public deliverables for the PACE project, one of which I've already mentioned, which is this customer perceptions report. But there's also this summary report on the Generation 2 systems, which essentially is a marketing pack for the project for anyone who's interested in looking at the technical specifications for these new units, and who wants to look at essentially how they might buy one themselves or to pass this information on to others at the technical level. So do look into that if you're interested. And there's also this slightly more on the technical side, a set of training materials for installers developed by the project. And the reason that this has been created is because we've noticed a bit of a bottleneck to deployment in that there's not a huge number of installers who are yet comfortable installing this technology or selling it to consumers across Europe. So this is our attempt to try and reverse that trend by providing a technical overview of how the fuel cell stack works, what sort of considerations you need for electrical and heating installation. But this is actually just a basic overview of the technology and its history as well and how it works. So if you're interested in a more sort of technical side of the project, then do look into that report. And we have a link here for the Generation 2 systems report. And we will also circulate links to these other two deliverables that I've mentioned. But at the moment, we're having trouble with the website. So those links will come out with the slide pack at the end. So thank you very much for listening. That's all I had to say in my section. So now I'll pass back to Thomas, and hopefully we have 10 minutes or so for some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, George, for your presentation. I've seen that there have been many questions during the presentations. Most questions have been technical. I see that Jan Willem has formulated already some replies in the chat function to everybody. So please have a look also at the chat function. There might already be some answers for you. Then, Jan Willem, there was a question about the mixture of natural gas and hydrogen. So in the future, gas grid operators might create a mixture of natural gas and hydrogen. How can our fuel cell systems function on a mixed fuel? Can you maybe shed some light on this?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question, and basically that is what we think is the future of the gas grid and the future of fuel cells now during the energy transition, and in a later stage when we might have 100% hydrogen in the grid. But the most likely scenario we and others currently see, also grid and grid operators and DSOs, is that there will be like 20-30% of hydrogen in the grid. So we put all our peaks from wind and solar, which we can't store on the electricity grid. We turn that into hydrogen and we mix that in the gas grid. So basically, indeed, you get a mix of hydrogen and natural gas or biogas. And we think that mixture would go up to 30%, which we can already cope with most of the fuel cells at least, or actually all if there are some slight adaptations. But most of the current appliances are already capable of using a mixture of 20-30% hydrogen in the mix, and the rest, of course, natural gas or methane. If we go higher, some adaptations like in the heating, in the heat system, the heat management inside of the unit would need to be made, like I explained in the chat. If we leave out the reforming process, then actually we have more heat. The reforming process needs heat, so if you don't use it, then of course you will have more heat left to use in the home, which is in some cases good, but not in summertime. So yeah, the efficiency, the power and electricity production, the power and heat production will shift towards 50-50 when you use more hydrogen or pure hydrogen. But again, the most likely scenario is that there will be 30% of hydrogen in the grid, and maybe up to 2030, 2040, and then there won't be a 50-50 and a 70-30 mix most likely, but we will shift towards 100% hydrogen in the grid at once, and therefore also need to shift all the appliances with it. With all the technical adaptations that that are necessary by that time.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and then we had another question regarding oxygen. I don't know if you replied to that question, but the question is, does the unit uses air or pure oxygen?
No, it uses air, so I think it's already explained more or less in the chat. But no, it can use just the air, outside air, and the 20% of oxygen is the only part that can go through the membrane of the fuel cell, and the rest is basically just ballast gas that needs to be heat up, but it also cools down the fuel cell, if you can speak of cooling. So yeah, it's air going into the oxygen is used. There's more air coming in to the fuel cell than is necessary. So basically, we always work with more oxygen than necessary and more air to be sure that stuff is not going to get overheated. And we will also have some heat left to use in the heat exchanger for domestic hot water or heating in the home.
Okay, thanks for this answer. I saw another question. Yes, so the slides, they will be distributed after this call together with the recording.
Thomas, I see there's a question on is there an economic argument for this technology without government support? And I'd just like to emphasize that yes is the short answer to that. As Jan Willem showed with that individual case study that he had in his slides. It's kind of a situation where it depends on your individual scenario. So if you're, for example, using an electricity-led system, and you're self-consuming that electricity to, for example, fuel your car, then obviously you have co-benefits. And if you live in like an older building with poor insulation potential, then this is automatically one of the cheaper low carbon electricity and heat options for your house. So there is certainly an economic argument without policy support. And as the unit price comes down over the next few years, which is certainly what we expect to happen, that argument will only get stronger. And as is always the case with this innovative technology, the aim is to reach a point where the individual average consumer can access this technology without any government help. It's just a case of driving down the price at the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot, George. And then we asked a question about the average price of a fuel cell unit for residential purposes. Maybe Jan Willem, can you give some examples from Solid Power?
Yes, I can give the list price of Solid Power units, which is around 25,000 in Germany, producing 13,000 kilowatt hours per year. So if you want to do that with a solar system, you at least need to put up 15 kilowatts of kilowatt peak of power PV panels on your roof. And that produces then over the year 30,000 kilowatt as well. And the investment of putting 15 kilowatt peak on your roof is more or less the same as such a fuel cell, with a big difference, of course. The fuel cell runs all the time and produces power all the time, also when the sun is not shining. And the solar panels, of course, do that only for 1,000 hours. In Spain, 2,000 hours. So it depends a little bit where you are. Nevertheless, it's of course the disadvantage of fuel cells is that they need fuel and you need to buy fuel, so you need to put gas into it. So whenever gas is very cheap and power is very expensive, you have a good business case if you don't have any other government support. But like I said, in the end, we need both systems. So we need both. We need all systems basically. We need wind. We need solar power. To produce renewable power when it's possible. And then we need to store that into the grid for all the days and nights that we don't have sunlight and that we don't have wind. So we can actually use the stored renewable energy with a fuel cell to produce the power at that moment. Because now we do this with coal-fired plants, gas-fired plants, nuclear, etc. But we want to get rid of all those fossil fuel using units. And therefore, if we want to do it just with renewables, then we need to store electricity in hydrogen. and hydrogen in the grid, and then take it out with fuel cells again. So that's, I think, the future that we're looking at.
Okay. Thanks a lot for that reply. So I've seen many questions now being asked. So as we have just 1 minute left, I suggest we pick one more question. I will also share the contact details of our speakers in a follow-up email. So yes, we are sorry we cannot answer all your questions, but please feel free to ask them to our speakers afterwards. So there was one. Can we compare a fuel cell to a Tesla battery with solar? Do you have any answer to that, Jan Willem or George?
Yeah, sure. It's a very good question because it we can give a very nice example for this. Tesla batteries are great if you have a solar system on your roof and you have a home battery system. But most of these systems are only like 6 kilowatt hours of storage capacity. So basically that's what you can use in 1 day or maybe in 2 days if you don't use much power. If you use a car, like a Tesla battery in a car, then it's like up to 80 kilowatt hours. But just to give you an example how much power you would need to actually store for the winter time, then you speak about 3,500 kilowatt hours that you need to feed your heat pump in winter time when you don't have solar or wind. So if you want to store all the power in batteries for winter time, then you need like 580 Tesla Powerwalls, yeah, or well, the equivalent of what was it again? Like 200 Tesla cars or 80 Tesla cars to actually be able to store enough power to survive the winter without any other sources. So yes, it's good to improve the self-consumption of your solar PV system and to avoid too much feeding back into the grid with a solar system, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. You only improve it a little bit, but it's definitely not the solution that we can use for the seasonal storage, because that's the actual underlying question here. Can we use batteries for seasonal storage? My answer would be no, definitely not. It's just too much batteries that we would need then per home. 580 Tesla Powerwalls per home is not really a good idea, apart from the cost and all the materials that we need for those.
And if I could very quickly add, sorry, Thomas, to steal another 20 seconds.
Go ahead, George.
When comparing solar and battery technologies to fuel cell and hydrogen technologies, I think it's always important to consider the sort of system integration point, which is that you're getting your hydrogen from a certain place, often in a future energy system that will be curtailed renewable energy, as Jan Willem mentioned in his presentation. So they're not so easy to directly compare because there's this sort of wider gas grid, kind of immediate sort of generation point to consider on top of the sort of direct comparison of the number of kilowatt storage, etc.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks a lot, Jan Willem and George, for the interesting presentations. We are sorry that we were not able to address all your questions, but as I said, you can send them to the speakers after this webinar. So today we were going to share with you in a follow-up email the recordings and presentations for you to re-listen. We would like to thank you all for your presence here at a webinar, and we hope it was interesting and that you could have learned some new insights today. So thank you all for your presence, and by this I conclude the webinar. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Thomas. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.